Welcome to the Effective Literacy Podcast. On today's episode, we have part 2 of our amazing interview with Jim Cummins, during which he talks about policy and family partnerships that help us to ensure we're explicitly creating a sense of belonging for all families. And additionally, he also shares what he's reading, which we love.
You've talked so much about lots of print access, this literacy socialization, this partnering with our families, right? And really making this community. And I like that phrasing that we're a big community because we're all working together to make sure that our students are literate in multiple languages, right? But I wanted to kind of switch gears and talk about policy and states, country, and our district policy that's really getting it right, that's really making sure that we're supporting our schools, our students, about making sure that they have this print access, that they're able to do the literacy socializations, that they're making that community. So are you familiar with any policy that you really think is getting it right?
Yeah, there's a number of things that come to mind as you're talking, Victoria. Let me give you a couple of research examples that go directly into policy. We all know preschool is important, but the qualification to that's often given is that it has to be high quality preschool. Well, what does high quality preschool mean for children who are from low income backgrounds and or children who are from multilingual backgrounds? One of the things that the research shows very clearly is that the extent to which there is a focus in the preschool environment on literacy socialization is key in terms of students' long-term literacy development. To me, one of the most persuasive research studies in this regard is a longitudinal study that was done in New Zealand. It was started back in the late 1990s. And what the researchers did was they went to a variety of preschool centers in New Zealand, and they looked at what was going on in terms of the preschool environment, in terms of interactions between teachers and students and other aspects of the environment. And they found 5 things that predicted long-term growth in literacy. 4 of these related to the kind of interaction that was going on between teachers and students. For example, teachers picking up on what students had said and elaborating that. But the 5th one was what they call literacy saturation. And this is the extent to which the preschool environment had a lot of books there, that teachers regularly read books to the students, that they did other things connected with books. And preschool environments that scored low on this index of literacy saturation had very few books around, and there wasn't much reading of books to children. What the researchers found was that at age 10, at age 14, and at age 16, children who had experienced a preschool environment that was characterized by literacy saturation, by immersion in a rich literacy environment, and this is long before children could decode or learn to read, they were doing significantly better in reading comprehension and other aspects of literacy than children who had attended preschools that had much less focus on literacy saturation. So the impact lasts for a long time. And another example comes from the work of Susan Newman, who was, I guess, Secretary of Education at one point in the Bush administration, but also a very accomplished researcher, where back in 1999, she published a report where the researchers gave a variety of books to a random set of preschool centers in the United States. I think they gave, I think it was maybe 5 books per student to the centers that were part of the treatment group. And the other centers just did what they would normally do. And they found, when they looked at the effect of this, just giving the books, extra books to the preschool centers, that these children were doing significantly better in early reading acquisition compared to children who had much less access to books. There's a huge amount of research out there summarized by a wide variety of researchers showing that print access has a direct causal impact on children's acquisition to read. So when we talk about policy, it's not enough to say, let's give everybody access to preschool. And there has been a lot of money going to preschools in the United States over the last couple of years. We need to focus on making sure that preschool environments are A, taking books seriously, immersing children in a rich literacy environment. And I'm not talking about teaching phonics. I'm not talking about direct instruction and phonemic awareness. I'm talking about getting kids aware that books exist, getting kids interested in books and listening to stories, getting kids dramatizing what's happening in the story, having fun with it, getting them to talk about what they're reading with each other. All of this is part of what happens in most middle-class families, and it's one of the major reasons why middle-class kids tend to experience relatively strong literacy development in comparison to children who are from low-income or close to poverty backgrounds. And so policy has got to focus on bridging the gap that's out there where we've talked only about teaching phonics and teaching foundational skills. In order for that to be effective, and in order that we don't repeat the mistakes of reading first, where we spent $6 billion and got virtually nothing out of it, we need to look at the other side of the coin and make sure that we are balancing phonics instruction and other foundational skills instruction with the kind of literacy socialization and literacy excitement that children need if they're going to become readers. So that's one of the major policy directions that I can see happening. And obviously this applies to early grades reading instruction also. The other thing I'd mention in terms of policy is that preschool environments should also focus on valuing and communicating a positive orientation to children's multilingualism. We should be inviting parents to come in and read books in their home language, ideally books that have an English version also, so the parent could read a page in the home language, whatever the home language might be. These could be community volunteers or parents. The teacher could read a similar page in English, and all children benefit from this. And again, there's research showing that this exact approach, it has significant benefits in terms of children's English literacy skills. So 2 things: literacy saturation at the preschool level and in the early grades, and valuing children's multilingualism. Because if we don't value children's multilingualism, we're devaluing it. And devaluing children's multilingualism is denying the relevance of their prior knowledge. And it is potentially denying them access to an invaluable personal resource, an invaluable tool for communication within their families. And that is not what education is all about.
As a former preschool teacher, this idea of literacy saturation is just such an amazing phrase. I don't know that I've ever heard that term, literacy saturation. I think as a classroom teacher, a preschool teacher, that's definitely a goal. As a personal reader, literacy saturation is also going to be my personal goal. But I also loved what you touched on with the idea of partnering with parents, that really gives them the reassurance that they are their child's first teacher. And when we bring them into the classroom or invite them into the classroom to share their language and to share with the class, it really is elevating that home language and honoring and allowing us to create an environment that creates a sense of belonging. And I really just appreciate the way that you phrased that. And that's so positive. So as a classroom teacher, whether it be preschool, early elementary, middle school, or even into high school, we have experiences that we know aren't so positive. And often there are district policies or state policies that make it hard for teachers to create such a positive experience. And sometimes those policies really create obstacles. And I know you're familiar with those obstacles, but what I want to know is, are there obstacles that you see that teachers and educators that we can actually do something about? Is there a particular policy that you see as an obstacle? And then what might a teacher, what might an administrator do to not necessarily circumvent and, just ignore that policy, but what might we be able to do to ensure that we're getting to that place of positivity that you were talking about in your previous answer?
I think the issues that you're talking about are very real. They're happening right now in a number of states and a number of districts where policymakers have swallowed hook, line, and sinker a lot of problematic perspectives on what's needed for early literacy instruction. And as I said, it's looking at one side of the coin. It's ignoring the findings of the National Reading Panel, even though they claim to be based on that. The National Reading Panel, as I said, endorsed a balanced approach to literacy instruction. And so one thing that teachers can do within their schools is to raise these issues at the school level and say, look, a policy that requires, let's take, for example, 60 minutes of phonics instruction, whole class phonics instruction per day, is not based on any research that is credible. Even, for example, researchers who endorse the broad approach of the science of reading have been very clear that that is a total overkill in terms of teaching phonics out of context. So when we look at that, we need to be aware of the general research that's out there. And it's not a case of not teaching foundational skills, but trying to make the link between children's development of phonics instruction and real books. So having classroom libraries that children can bring home and read with their parents, encouraging parents to get access to books or to in their home language or in English, whichever they want or feel comfortable with, and reading to students is a key element. If you're limited by policies in terms of the extent to which you can do that in schools, then maybe parents can provide that literacy socialization that they may not have realized is important. I think we can also do things that look at what has happened elsewhere. This example comes from a Canadian elementary school that I was familiar with, and it's had visited on a number of occasions. And they were in an inner city school. About 90% of the kids in the school came from non-English speaking backgrounds. And one of the ways that they tried to create a context of parental involvement and increasing kids' engagement with literacy was to take some of the funds that they got from being an inner city school, and they kept the school library open 4 days a week from about 4 o'clock until 7 o'clock, so that parents could come in when they picked up their kids at 4 o'clock. They could go straight into the school library. They spent some time there reading to their children. They had a multilingual collection that parents had contributed to, parent books in different languages that children had grown out of. They donated to the library. The school gave parents library cards, so they were formally a member of the school library, and they could use this card to check out any number of books. When they brought books back, they could get some more for them to read with their children. So this is the kind of, imaginative response that we could talk about within our schools. If we're mandated to use a program that we don't particularly like, we can say, well, what's missing from this, and how can we work around it? And teachers, as you know far better than I, are incredibly creative people, incredibly resilient, and we can find ways of looking at what the research is saying and finding ways to implement that in our schools and classrooms.
I love it. I mean, talking about the libraries and keeping them open, giving us so many ideas to think about. And as Anna said, this phrase of literacy saturation. Jim, we're coming to the end here, but we really want to talk about your literacy saturation, right? We believe that if education's done their job and we all graduate with that literate adult individual, that we continue to read and write throughout the rest of our life. And that we're constantly reading for pleasure, for learning, we're writing to process and everything. So we want to know from you, what are you currently reading or writing? And it could be personally, it could be professionally, but what are you currently engrossed in?
Well, up to about last summer, I was very much engrossed in wrapping up that book, Rethinking the Education of Multilingual Learners, which tries to bring together the work I've done and work other people have done and look at what this is saying for policy and for practice. There's a long last chapter in this book that basically plays out or reflects the idea of teachers as knowledge generators, where work that teachers have done in terms of bringing students' home languages into the classroom and using those home languages as resources is reviewed. And like, this work is not the result of anything that I said to teachers or other researchers have said to teachers. It's a result typically of a collaboration where we've bounced ideas around, and then teachers have gone and done amazing things. So I try to follow that up in the past year in terms of talking about what this might look like and helping to spread the words of what teachers have been doing. But I've also got involved in the debates about reading that are happening in both Canada and the United States. There was a report that came out in February in Canada from the Ontario Human Rights Commission that basically bought into the notion that kids are failing to read because they're not being given enough phonics. And I wrote a critique of that, which I think you have access to and other people can have access to. It's ironic because Ontario and Canada are typically amongst the world's top performers in terms of reading development. For example, the Program for International Student Assessment that the Organization for Economic Cooperation does based every 3 years or so has shown Canada and Ontario to be in the top 3 in terms of reading instruction. And so to say that kids are not learning to read in school because they're not getting enough phonics has a logical problem there when Canadian schools are doing much better than most other countries. So there's issues like that I've been involved in. In terms of what I'm reading outside of academic work, I listen to quite a few audiobooks when I'm traveling up to a cottage. But the book that I'm reading right now is a book by T.C. Boyle called Outside Looking In. T.C. Boyle is an amazing California author who's written multiple books on interesting topics. Often he does kind of fictional biographies of well-known people. This is a sort of fictional biography of Timothy Leary, who started off all of the psychedelic revolution in Cambridge in the 1960s. I'm about 1/3 of the way through it, and it's quite fascinating. But that's it's a couple of years since I've read any other books by him, but I've read maybe 10 in total, and they're always incredibly enjoyable. So that's how I'm spending my time these days.
Oh, I love it. And I love a good book recommendation for us. So, I mean, you've read a lot, Jim, right? So the hardest question of this interview, what might be your favorite book of all time?
Okay. I didn't actually have to think very long about that because the book I've enjoyed most, and I go back to, is a book by a person called John Kennedy Toole, Toole, called A Confederacy of Dunces. It was a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, I think, in the early 80s. And it's an incredibly tragicomic book. It's set in New Orleans. There's a larger-than-life character. The protagonist is somebody called Ignatius, who's a big man who's highly educated as far as using a lot of big words. I appreciated the fact that all of these Latin-based and Greek-based words are being used totally inappropriately in conversational contexts by him. But I'd strongly recommend it as a book that is incredibly engaging, incredibly gripping, and also very poignant. It's the story behind it is also very poignant. The author, John Kennedy Toole, wrote it in the 1960s, and it was rejected by multiple publishers. And he sadly committed suicide in I think it was 1969. And then in the manuscript was just left there. His mother sort of discovered it and thought this was worth publishing. And so she tried to get it published and eventually did. And there was in 1980, so a long time later. And again, as I said, it won the Pulitzer Prize. But it's a book that, again, I'd strongly recommend to anybody who wants a good read, engaging, funny, poignant, and a book that I keep going back to.
Awesome. I'm going to put that one on my list. Well, thank you so much for listening. We are the Effective Literacy Podcast. Mr. Jim Cummins, thank you thank you for imparting your wisdom and sharing your thoughts with us today. We have learned and have so much to take away and really ponder as we consider what we can do when we are moving forward when it comes to creating effective literacy for our students. For more information, to get access to the different resources that were mentioned in today's podcast, please visit our show notes at themultiliteracy.org. Make sure to subscribe to our podcast. And again, Mr. Jim Cummins, thank you so very much for being with us today.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the work you're doing.